I'm Reverend David Hazeldine, and this is my story about God's majestic mercy. On Saturday, the 2nd of November 2019, I had 4 strokes in one day, 3 in the morning and then 1 in the evening. And as I was taken into the hospital in Woolwich, I was under the impression that I just had some kind of infection because nothing was showing on my observations from the paramedics. But it's when I entered the building in the evening that my 4th stroke hit, and that was what's called a brainstem stroke. At this time, I was 46, and my context of ministry was I've been ordained for 10 years. I was ordained through the Baptist Union of Great Britain, through Oxford University, and this was my 2nd church in Belvedere in East London, which I've been working with for 3 years. So my condition, after those 4 strokes, I was left with what's called locked-in syndrome. And that's where you're completely paralyzed inside and out. And that meant not just my toes, my limbs or my fingers or my mouth, things you could see, but also my throat and my chest and my stomach muscles and all my breathing muscles. So I had to have air pumped into me, and I was nil by mouth for nearly 6 months. I couldn't eat or swallow. And because all our throat muscles mine were paralyzed, I had to have all the saliva sucked out of my throat 5 or 6 times a day to avoid me drowning in my own saliva. So it was a really difficult time. The prognosis that the consultants gave my wife in the first few days after the strokes was that I would probably die of the chest infection I had. And if I survived the chest infection, I'd most probably have one final stroke because I was too weak to fight off anything, and that would kill me off. But with 10 to 20% chance of survival, they said I might be doing really, really well if I was brought into institutional care where they give me 24/7 round care to help me eat and drink and sleep and clean, and I'd be there for the rest of my life. And that was given as a good prognosis. Before all this was made known to me, I was in a coma for 24 to 48 hours. And as I woke from the coma, I had my eyes closed like you would in the morning when you're waking up. And I knew the darkness that I could see was my eyelids, not the room. And it was at that point where God spoke to me. And he told me what had happened and what was going to happen and why. And there's a similar story to this in the New Testament where we see Jesus. He meets a man who's full of demons, has a legion of demons in Mark chapter 5. And before this man can even speak to him, and similar to me, not able to speak because I was paralyzed, I received that mercy of God. He spoke in a dramatic way about how my prognosis would go and how I would come out of the situation I was in. I knew what was going to happen, but I didn't know how it was exactly going to happen. And just like the man in this story, he received the commission from God to go and tell people about the mercy that he had and how wonderful it had been. And he went all around the western side of the Sea of Galilee, just sharing about God's majestic mercy, just before Jesus later on came down to that same area and had a wonderful ministry time there where many people were healed. And I knew that as I was locked in and suffering for 2.5 months in this condition, where all I could do was communicate through an alphabet board, through my eyelids blinking, I knew that God was going to use me to share this testimony and to explain God's wonderful mercy. So even though it might sound the most dreadful, terrible thing to wake up thinking you were just having an infection, when actually to be told that you had a brainstem stroke and you had locked-in syndrome, that's the most terrifying thing for many people to experience. But for me, I had such a deep peace because I'd heard the word of the Lord. When you think about God's mercy, as Christians, we can fall into a trap of thinking that his mercy is just for salvation. And when we receive that mercy, we move on into God's wonderful grace, which in some respects we do. But the grace of God is not the foundation of our Christian life. The mercy of God is the foundation. Imagine you had a house and its foundations were taken away. The house would fall down. And all the grace that we receive from God every day of our lives is based on the mercy of God. We are saved by grace, but that's because of mercy. So I spent 11 days in ICU in St George's Hospital in London, and then was moved to Lewisham to a special stroke ward. And I was there for 2.5 months, and all the time communicating through my eyelids blinking and my wife writing down what I was saying. And then we would converse that way. It wasn't speaking, but just my eyelids. But to me, it made me feel not locked in, because I was able to communicate and express to the outside world what I felt God was doing and what I felt was going to happen. But also during that time, things started to happen to my body that the consultants weren't expecting at all. My right ankle began to move perfectly as if nothing had ever happened, and that was after about 3 or 4 weeks. Then my right hand started to move a little bit. When I say a little bit, I mean 1 or 2 millimeters. I do mean hardly at all. But these movements were indications to the staff that something was beginning to happen. And then the consultant came around and did various touch tests on my body, and we discovered that I could feel everything everywhere, which is a very rare situation for those experiencing locked-in syndrome. So then the decision was taken to move me to the hospital called the Royal Hospital for Neurodisability in Putney, and it's there that I underwent 7 months of rehabilitation. And whilst there, as you know, I got there before COVID was even a thing, but in that time COVID hit and we had the first lockdown. And by that time, a quarter of the hospital that I was in died around me. It's a very disconcerting time. And I was the 11th and final person in my particular ward to actually contract COVID. But I couldn't understand why that would happen to me after such a wonderful recovery that I was experiencing, only to be killed and struck down by COVID. And so I couldn't receive all those negative doubts that were coming through, having watched all the news reports from Downing Street every day. But it was a very lonely time when I was in isolation for 2 weeks. I was stuck in a wheelchair, which was stuck to my feeding apparatus. I couldn't move. I heard a lot of people moaning on the news about not being able to get out of their flats or get outside. And I was thinking to myself, I can't even walk or move from this chair or move the chair I'm in. A, I wasn't strong enough, and B, it was rigged up to equipment. And that was a time, even then in that bizarre situation, God dealt with my heart and opened me up to more of his mercy and to understand about the purpose of suffering and what he wants to do and what he wants to bring out of that. And it was during that time when my wife couldn't see me, my kids couldn't see me either. Not least that they had the trauma of not being able to see me in ICU apart from once where they thought it might be the last time. They also now couldn't come to the hospital and see me. But I experienced, when they were away, some wonderful milestones in the fact that I learned to drink, I learned to swallow, I learned to sing, and I learned to feed myself, and I began to start walking and showering myself. I took a few steps with various aids, some electrical aids that helped me stand. And it was towards the end of July where one of the occupational therapists said to me, "We think that we can get you home without a care package." And what they meant was, if they gave me another 6 weeks, they felt that I could be completely independent. It would be a struggle. I would have a walker like an old lady walking around between that and a wheelchair, but I'll be able to get home without a care package. So on the 14th of August 2020, I had a wonderful experience where I was able to walk a few steps out of the hospital ward and give great glory to what God was doing in my body. It was a wonderful moment. When I got home, obviously you can imagine I was really interested in finding out about locked-in syndrome and to see what the odds were of my recovery, because I knew something was incredible was happening, but my wife and my family weren't really of the mind to have a look and search and find out what the situation was with it. They just wanted me to get better. That was their focus. But I found out that I could only find out there were 16 people, up to this date today, only 16 people that have survived locked-in syndrome to my situation, where they can stand completely independently, walk around. And that's not just 16 people in the UK or in Europe, that's 16 people in the entire world since the beginning of social media. That's the last 10, 15 years. That's how rare the situation is where you can recover from locked-in syndrome. Everyone else just dies or spend the rest of their life in a nursing home like I was given the prognosis of. And I think greatly about these things, and I realise that there is a purpose to this suffering. That in 1 Peter 1 verse 17, God explains, or Peter explains, that our faith is being tested because it's more precious than gold. And so often we're caught up in our little lives and we forget the true majesty and awesomeness of God. And our faith is such an incredibly personable, wonderful, precious thing that it is God's duty to make that stronger and produce that independence within us, so that we can be trusting God in such a stronger way. And all the suffering that we experience is to bring us to a deeper and stronger faith in God. Now, I'm at the position where I'm starting to learn to drive again. I've been on a foreign holiday last year and going again this year. I've had a wonderful opportunity to go around churches most weeks for last year, sharing about God's mercy and all that He's done. I'm in a wonderful financial position now that I couldn't even imagine before my stroke. I'm even beginning to start making inquiries about working again. And I do really feel, I understand Job's situation where you experience such suffering at the beginning of his story, but then right at the end, he experienced a wonderful vision of God and how majestic He was. And after that vision, his life was completely pulled round to the right way of thinking about life. And it was better at the end than the beginning. And that's what God has for us. In our sickness, in our suffering, we can receive wonderful miracles from God, as I have, but also sufferings to come through in great strength and faith, just as Job did and I did too. The outcomes really for me are that I've been able to share my story in 2 books. My story called Don't Get Excited But explains how this mercy unfolds in much greater detail than I'm able to go into today. And I really hope that's a great encouragement to many people. It's available on Amazon. And all that I've learned about God's majestic mercy is written down in a book called The Majestic Meaning of God's Mercy, that it began to explain to me before these strokes. And I began to write the book and just finished it about 2 weeks before the strokes happened. And all the time I was in ICU, hearing God speak to me, I knew the first thing I had to do when I was recovered was I had to write this book. And that's indeed what I did. So I really encourage people on hearing this as I finish, just to receive that merciful disposition that Jesus has. Before the man in the story was able to, in Mark chapter 5, able to speak to Jesus and ask for deliverance, I wasn't even able to speak because of the paralysis, but Jesus has a merciful disposition where He is attentive to our suffering. And just be encouraged that God knows your need and is reaching out to you right now. And wherever you are, however you feel, I really encourage you to be open to that majestic mercy.